Welcome to Historical Pulse, the channel where history doesn't just live in books. It breathes, speaks, and shapes the world we live in today. Imagine an ordinary woman on an ordinary bus riding home after a long day of work. She isn't famous. She isn't wealthy. She isn't planning to change the course of American history. Yet, with one quiet decision, the decision to remain seated, she ignites a movement that reshapes a nation's conscience and helps dismantle one of the most deeply entrenched systems of racial injustice in the modern world. This is the story of Rosa Parks, not just the woman who refused to give up her seat, but the lifelong activist, strategist, and symbol of dignity whose courage transformed the American civil rights movement and inspired generations across the globe. Rosa Louise McCauley was born on February 4, 1913, in Tuskegee, Alabama, a region steeped in the painful legacy of slavery and Reconstruction-era backlash. Her mother, Leona Edwards, was a teacher, and her father, James McCauley, was a carpenter. When Rosa was still young, her parents separated, and she moved with her mother and younger brother, Sylvester, to live on her grandparents' farm in Pine Level, Alabama. That farm became Rosa's earliest classroom in racial reality. The South in the early 20th century was governed by Jim Crow laws, a web of legal and social rules enforcing racial segregation. Black Americans were denied basic civil rights, excluded from political participation, and subjected to intimidation, violence, and economic exploitation. For Rosa, racism was not an abstract concept. It was something she saw, heard, and felt daily. Her grandparents had lived through slavery. Her grandfather, in particular, often stood guard outside their home at night with a shotgun, protecting the family from possible attacks by white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Young Rosa would lie awake listening for danger, absorbing early lessons about injustice, fear, and survival. Education became both a refuge and a battlefield. Rosa attended rural segregated schools where students walked miles to reach poorly funded classrooms while white children rode buses to better equipped schools nearby. The injustice of this disparity did not escape her. Even as a child, she felt deeply troubled by the unfairness of a system that treated people differently based solely on the color of their skin. Despite these obstacles, Rosa showed academic promise. She eventually enrolled at the Montgomery Industrial School for Girls, a progressive institution run by Northern white women who encouraged independent thinking and racial pride. There, Rosa encountered teachers who challenged the norms of Southern segregation and instilled in her a belief that black students deserve dignity, education, and opportunity equal to anyone else. Later, she attended Alabama State Teachers College for Negroes, though she was forced to leave before graduating in order to care for her sick grandmother and mother. Even so, her exposure to education sharpened her awareness of injustice and strengthened her resolve to resist it, even if quietly. In 1932, Rosa married Raymond Parks, a barber and civil rights activist who was already involved in efforts to defend black men falsely accused of crimes, including the famous Scottsboro Boys case, in which 9 black teenagers were wrongly accused of raping 2 white women. Raymond's activism deeply influenced Rosa, introducing her to organized resistance against racial injustice and encouraging her to continue her education, which she eventually completed by earning her high school diploma, a rare achievement for black women in the South at that time. Together, Rosa and Raymond formed a partnership rooted in mutual respect, shared political awareness, and commitment to justice. Their home became a place where ideas about racial equality were discussed openly, quietly preparing Rosa for the role history would later thrust upon her. In the early 1940s, Rosa Parks joined the Montgomery chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, one of the leading civil rights organizations in the United States. She became the chapter's secretary, a role she would hold for over a decade. Though the position might have sounded administrative, it was anything but passive. As secretary, Rosa documented cases of racial violence, discrimination, and abuse, including sexual assault of black women by white men, crimes that were routinely ignored by the justice system. She interviewed victims, recorded testimony, and helped coordinate legal challenges. This work exposed her to the harsh realities of Southern racism in its rawest forms and strengthened her resolve to confront injustice, not merely endure it. One of her most significant early efforts involved the case of Reese Taylor, a black woman who was kidnapped and gang-raped by white men in 1944. Rosa Parks traveled across Alabama to investigate the crime, collect evidence, and organize community support. Despite overwhelming proof, the perpetrators were never convicted. The case deeply affected Rosa, reinforcing her understanding that racism was not just about segregation but about power, violence, and systemic denial of justice. These years shaped Rosa not as a passive symbol, but as a seasoned activist, disciplined, thoughtful, and strategic. She attended workshops at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, an interracial training center for civil rights organizers where she learned about nonviolent protest, community organizing, and leadership development. There, she met other activists and was encouraged to see herself not simply as someone enduring injustice, but as someone capable of changing it. By the early 1950s, Rosa Parks had become deeply embedded in the local struggle for civil rights in Montgomery, Alabama, a city where segregation was rigidly enforced, especially on public transportation. Montgomery's bus system was governed by rules requiring black passengers to sit in the back of the bus and give up their seats to white passengers if the front section became full. Black riders were also required to board through the front door to pay their fare, then exit and re-enter through the back, and drivers often drove off before they could reboard. Humiliation was built into the system by design. Rosa herself had experienced this mistreatment firsthand. Years earlier, she had been forced off a bus by a driver named James F. Blake after she boarded through the front, paid her fare, and attempted to re-enter through the back, only for Blake to drive off, leaving her in the rain. She walked home humiliated, but determined never to ride a bus driven by that man again. Yet fate would bring them together again. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was working as a seamstress at a Montgomery department store. After finishing her shift, she boarded a Cleveland Avenue bus driven by the same James Blake and sat in the first row of seats designated for black passengers. The front of the bus, reserved for white riders, gradually filled. When a white man boarded and found no seat, Blake demanded that Rosa and 3 other black passengers move to make room. The other 3 complied. Rosa did not. Contrary to later myths, Rosa was not physically exhausted, though she had worked all day. But more importantly, she was tired of giving in. She later explained, "The only tired I was tired of giving in." When Blake asked her again to stand, Rosa calmly refused. He threatened to have her arrested. She replied, "You may do that," and he did. Rosa Parks was arrested and charged with violating Montgomery's segregation laws. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and jailed, a humiliating experience that echoed through her memory for years. That night, she called her husband and the local NAACP president, E.D. Nixon, who arranged her bail. But what might have been another forgotten arrest in the long history of racial injustice became something entirely different. Civil rights leaders in Montgomery had long been searching for the right moment and the right person to challenge bus segregation in court. Rosa Parks, with her impeccable reputation, quiet dignity, and established activism, was the ideal figure. Her case became the spark that ignited the Montgomery Bus Boycott, one of the most significant grassroots movements in American history. Within days of Rosa's arrest, Black leaders organized a one-day boycott of Montgomery's buses to coincide with her court hearing. Thousands of Black residents, who made up the majority of the bus system's riders, refused to ride. The buses ran nearly empty. The success of that first day inspired organizers to extend the boycott indefinitely. A new organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, was formed to coordinate the effort, and a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. was chosen as its president, marking the beginning of his rise to national prominence. For 381 days, Montgomery's Black community walked, carpooled, and organized alternative transportation systems rather than submit to segregation. Domestic workers walked miles to white neighborhoods. Elderly residents leaned on canes as they made long journeys on foot. Churches became transportation hubs. Black taxi drivers charged reduced fares in solidarity. Despite harassment, intimidation, arrests, and economic retaliation, the boycott held. Rosa Parks herself became a symbol of the movement, though her life during this period was anything but easy. She and her husband both lost their jobs. They received death threats. Their phone rang constantly with anonymous callers promising violence. Yet Rosa never wavered. Behind the scenes, lawyers challenged Montgomery's bus segregation laws in federal court. In November 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. On December 21, 1956, just over a year after Rosa's arrest, Montgomery officially desegregated its bus system. When Rosa boarded a bus that day and sat wherever she wished, it was not just a personal victory. It was a landmark moment in American civil rights history. The Montgomery Bus Boycott demonstrated the power of nonviolent resistance, economic pressure, and community solidarity. It proved that ordinary people, united in purpose, could challenge deeply entrenched systems of injustice. Yet the victory came at a steep cost. Despite her historic role, Rosa Parks did not become wealthy or secure. In fact, her life in Montgomery became increasingly difficult. Unable to find work due to her activism and facing ongoing threats, she and Raymond eventually left Alabama in 1957 and moved to Detroit, Michigan, hoping for better opportunities and a safer life. Detroit, often called the North, promised freedom from Jim Crow laws, but Rosa quickly discovered that racism was not confined to the South. While segregation was no longer enforced by law, it persisted through housing discrimination, employment barriers, police brutality, and economic inequality. Rosa once said that the North felt just as segregated, but in a different way. In Detroit, Rosa continued her activism quietly but persistently. She worked as a seamstress, a hospital aide, and later as a secretary and receptionist for U.S. Congressman John Conyers, whom she helped get elected in 1964. She would hold that position for over 2 decades, assisting constituents, addressing community concerns, and advocating for social justice behind the scenes. But Rosa Parks was never content to be remembered solely as the woman who sat on a bus. She viewed that moment not as an isolated act of bravery, but as one step in a lifelong journey of resistance. Throughout the 1960s and beyond, she became involved in broader struggles for racial equality, economic justice, housing reform, voting rights, and anti-war activism. She participated in the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. She supported the Selma to Montgomery marches for voting rights. She spoke out against police brutality, racial profiling, and urban poverty. She sympathized with the Black Power movement, understanding the frustration and anger of younger activists even when she did not always agree with their methods. Rosa also became an outspoken critic of violence, militarism, and imperialism. She opposed the Vietnam War and spoke out against apartheid in South Africa. Her vision of justice extended beyond racial equality in the United States to human dignity worldwide. In the 1970s, Rosa faced personal tragedy. Her husband Raymond died in 1977 after years of illness. Shortly afterward, her brother Sylvester also passed away. These losses left her deeply grieving and financially strained. For a time, Rosa struggled to make ends meet, relying on modest earnings from speaking engagements and support from friends. Despite these hardships, she continued to work, write, and speak, refusing to retreat into quiet retirement. In 1987, she co-founded the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development, an organization dedicated to youth education, leadership training, and civil rights awareness. Through programs like Pathways to Freedom, the Institute took young people on trips retracing key routes of the Underground Railroad and the Civil Rights Movement, connecting history to lived experience. Rosa believed deeply in education, not just formal schooling, but moral education. She wanted young people to understand that social change did not come from waiting for heroes, but from ordinary individuals choosing courage over comfort. Her life became a living curriculum. As the years passed, Rosa Parks received increasing recognition for her contributions. In 1979, she was awarded the NAACP's Spingarn Medal. In 1983, she was inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. In 1996, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States, from President Bill Clinton. 3 years later, she was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, another of the nation's highest honors. Yet despite these accolades, Rosa remained humble. She resisted being mythologized as a passive figure who simply stumbled into history. She emphasized that her act of resistance was not accidental, impulsive, or isolated. It was deliberate, thoughtful, and rooted in years of organizing, education, and quiet defiance. She often said that she was not physically tired when she refused to give up her seat. She was tired of injustice. That distinction mattered deeply to her. She wanted people to understand that social change is not born from exhaustion alone, but from conviction, from the belief that dignity is not negotiable. As she aged, Rosa Parks became increasingly revered as a living symbol of the civil rights movement. Yet she remained deeply concerned about the persistence of racism, poverty, violence, and inequality in American society. She watched with sadness as urban communities struggled with unemployment, crime, mass incarceration, and educational inequality. She expressed disappointment that many of the gains of the civil rights era had not translated into lasting economic justice for millions of Black Americans. Still, she never abandoned hope. Rosa believed that progress was slow but real, uneven but possible. She believed in the power of young people to challenge injustice and reshape society. And she believed in the enduring force of nonviolence, not as passivity, but as disciplined resistance rooted in moral clarity. In her later years, Rosa Parks lived quietly in Detroit, rarely seeking attention, but graciously accepting opportunities to speak to students, activists, and leaders. She continued to advocate for civil rights causes and youth empowerment well into her 80s and 90s. On October 24, 2005, Rosa Parks passed away at the age of 92. Her death marked the end of an era, not only because she was one of the last surviving icons of the early civil rights movement, but because her life embodied a moral clarity that felt increasingly rare in a divided world. The nation responded with extraordinary honor. Rosa Parks became the first woman and the second Black person in American history to lie in honor at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, a privilege typically reserved for presidents and military leaders. Thousands of people filed past her casket, paying their respects to a woman whose courage had helped reshape the nation. Her funeral in Detroit drew world leaders, civil rights activists, artists, students, and ordinary citizens, all united by gratitude for a woman who had stood still so that history could move forward. But Rosa Parks' legacy is not confined to ceremonies, statues, or textbooks. It lives in every movement for justice that dares to challenge entrenched power with dignity and resolve. It lives in every young person who believes that one voice can matter. It lives in every refusal to accept injustice as normal or inevitable. She taught the world that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers calmly, firmly, and without apology. To understand Rosa Parks fully, we must go beyond the bus seat. Her story is not about a single act of defiance, but about a lifetime of resistance. She was not simply a tired seamstress who stumbled into history. She was a trained activist, a community organizer, a strategist, and a lifelong advocate for justice. Someone who understood that real change requires persistence, sacrifice, and moral discipline. She also reminds us that history is not shaped only by presidents, generals, or lawmakers. It is shaped by ordinary people who refuse to accept unjust rules. People who challenge systems not through violence, but through conscience. Rosa Parks did not overthrow a government. She did not command armies. She did not write laws. Yet her refusal to move helped dismantle one of the most powerful legal systems of racial oppression in American history. And she did so not with anger, not with threats, but with quiet, unwavering dignity. That dignity, more than any single law or ruling, became her most powerful weapon. Her life also complicates easy narratives about heroism. Rosa Parks was not fearless. She admitted that she was afraid when she was arrested, afraid when her phone rang with threats, afraid when her family lost income, afraid when violence loomed. But she acted anyway. Courage, in her story, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward despite it. She also rejected the idea that her act alone ended segregation. She consistently credited the thousands of ordinary people who walked for over a year, the organizers who coordinated carpools, the lawyers who argued cases, the ministers who preached courage, and the activists who risked their safety daily. Rosa Parks understood that social change is collective, built not by lone heroes, but by communities willing to endure hardship together. This humility became one of her defining traits. Even as she received national and international honors, she insisted that the real heroes were those who remained unnamed, the domestic workers, laborers, students, and elders who refused to ride buses, who endured harassment, who lost jobs, and who risked violence in pursuit of dignity. Her life also illustrates the long arc of justice, not as a smooth curve, but as a struggle marked by progress and setback, victory and disappointment. The desegregation of buses did not end racism. Voting rights victories did not end economic inequality. Legal change did not automatically produce social equality. Rosa Parks understood this painfully well, especially as she confronted urban segregation, police brutality, and systemic poverty in the North. Yet, she refused to surrender to cynicism. She believed that justice was not a destination but a responsibility, something each generation must struggle for anew. In her own words, each person must live their life as a model for others. That philosophy shaped not only her public actions but her private conduct. Those who knew her personally described her as gentle, soft-spoken, deeply spiritual, and quietly firm. She did not seek conflict, but she did not avoid it when conscience demanded confrontation. She was courteous even to those who disrespected her, yet unwavering in her insistence on dignity. This combination, humility and firmness, gentleness and resolve, became the moral signature of her life. Today, Rosa Parks' name is taught in classrooms across the world. Streets, schools, libraries, and institutions bear her name. Her image appears in museums, textbooks, and documentaries. Yet perhaps her most enduring legacy lies not in monuments, but in the example she set, an example that continues to resonate in struggles for justice far beyond race or nationality. Her story speaks to anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. It reminds us that resistance does not always require loud voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it begins with a simple refusal, a refusal to accept humiliation, a refusal to surrender dignity, a refusal to comply with injustice. Rosa Parks' act was small in motion, remaining seated, but monumental in consequence. It reminds us that systems of oppression often depend not only on force but on compliance. And when compliance ends, even quietly, power begins to shift. She also teaches us that preparation matters. Her moment on the bus was not spontaneous. It was the product of years of activism, education, reflection, and struggle. Rosa Parks did not wake up that morning planning to change history. But when history called, she was ready. And perhaps that is her greatest lesson. We do not always know when our moment will come, but we can prepare ourselves through conscience, learning, and courage to meet it when it does. In an age where injustice often feels overwhelming, global in scale, systemic in nature, and deeply entrenched, Rosa Parks' story offers both realism and hope. Realism because she understood that progress is slow and fragile. Hope because she proved that even in the darkest systems, light can emerge from the smallest acts of defiance. Her life challenges us not to ask, "What can one person do?" but rather, what happens when one person refuses to accept injustice and others follow? History answers that question clearly. One woman sits, a community walks, a city changes, a nation awakens, and the world is never quite the same again. Welcome to Historiopulse, where stories of courage, resistance, and transformation remind us that history is not distant. It is alive in every choice we make today. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.